1. A loving father from Minneapolis, publicly murdered. 2. An epidemic, perhaps perpetuated by a lack of self-control, which is worsening despite a seemingly obvious solution. And 3. A pandemic that has irreversibly changed the landscape of our lives and continues to do so as I speak. But how are these things linked? And how can we even start to solve these problems when we're not really sure of their causes? Let's go back to December 2019. Coronavirus washed over the world and forced us to look at what really mattered: surviving. We locked down and worked from home as if the world was ending. It was for so many. But this effect was not evenly spread. When I tested positive for COVID-19 in December 2020, I thought that it was a death sentence. I thought that the indigenous Caribbean part of my heritage and my BMI of over 45 would put me in the ground, or at the very least in an intensive care bed. And everywhere I looked convinced me further. The news, online articles, social media, health campaigning, you name it. Anxious and overwhelmed, I said to myself, Han, let's break this down. I looked at the study that had everybody so panicked by the World Obesity Federation. But when I found the part that had everyone so worried, I realized we'd been a little misled. Yes, increased risks of COVID are associated with increased BMI or obesity, but not as much as being older or perhaps being of the male sex. Additionally, deprivation plays a huge role in COVID-19 outcomes, with the most deprived facing an increased risk of death comparable to that of people with chronic liver failure and diabetes. We also know that race and deprivation are intertwined, with the systemic remnants of colonialism impacting all areas of our lives. This can include housing segregation, likelihood to be in high exposure jobs, and the inability to social distance, self-isolate, or work from home due to overcrowding. But, understandably, race, sex, and age are not modifiable risk factors. So surely we could just lose weight, reduce our risks of dying of COVID, and all the other diseases that are associated with obesity, like coronary heart disease, strokes, diabetes, and cancer. Well, as someone who's lost weight by dieting, and regained even more, I knew that the smart choices that I made in the past, and still some of which I make to this day, were not going to take my weight to a healthy range. I did what doctors, fitness experts, and society tells us to do. I ate less and moved more. But I didn't see the results that I was supposed to. Fast forward a few years, and while in medical school, I learned that long-term weight loss is pretty much impossible. Yes, you heard me right, and let me explain. Truthfully, we don't really know the true factors that determine our weight. But what we do know is that our hormones, genetics, and the environment to an extent all have a part to play. Our bodies like to stay at what's known as a set point weight, a comfort range that's individual and varies by about 5 to 10 kilograms either way. What determines this set point is largely genetic, and it's really hard to manipulate. Evidence for the genetic basis of weight comes from the studies of twins and adoptees. Identical twins, so twins with the exact same DNA, are separated and put on different diet plans and exercise regimes. And it's found that their BMIs remain almost exactly the same. Additionally, people who are adopted from young show more similar BMIs to their biological parents compared with their adoptive ones, showing us that weight has a much more genetic component than we thought. Furthermore, meta-analyses, so studies of studies, show that diets don't actually produce long-term weight loss. In fact, up to 95% of dieters will regain the weight they lose short-term, showing us that something we thought was controllable with sheer willpower is maybe controllable temporarily, at best. And when we do try to control that number on the scale, our health can actually worsen. Physically, we see a decreased basal metabolic rate and decreased muscle mass, and an increased propensity to store fat. Psychologically, we obsess over food, and we are more likely to binge and feel guilt and shame when we don't see the results that we want. This can lead us to an increased risk of depression, anxiety, and eating disorders, let alone the chronic stress one might face living in a world where fat stigma is still a real issue. When I realized that the figures around COVID-19 and obesity were being used to cause fear and panic around fatness, I wanted to know why. If obesity hasn't been yet directly proven to cause more severe outcomes from COVID-19, then why make us so worried about it, especially if it's something that's so out of our control? Well, there are two main reasons for this. The first one is money. Fear sells. $176 billion a year to be exact, and by 2022, the diet industry could be worth over $245 billion. Considering that these products that we call diets don't actually work, and what's more, they can actually worsen our health, that's a lot of money we're spending on the thin ideal. Also, the diet industry has much more to gain from causing yo-yo dieting or weight cycling, which is actually one of the largest determinants of obesity, than there is to just let us be comfortable in our bodies and encourage behaviors that might actually improve our health, like eating a varied and balanced diet, engaging in enjoyable exercise, and cultivating our mental health and self-care practice. But when did we start using weight as a tool to judge people in the first place? Now that brings me on to my second reason. The legacy of colonialism. At the advent of the transatlantic slave trade, negative stereotypes around Black people were being formed and embedded into Western society. Black people were viewed as utterly carefree animals who were sexually and orally indulgent. Physically, it was noted that Africans were more plump and voluptuous, resulting in this association between Blackness, largeness, and unattractiveness, and the opposite view that whiteness was associated with goodness, purity, beauty, and thinness. A few centuries later, these perceived stereotypes still persisted as the field of race science was used by influential white men to claim superiority over their colonized subjects. Black women were viewed as so biologically inferior that they would eventually die off due to their unwieldy size and animal appetites. Newsflash, we're still here. Considering this was only a few hundred years ago, it's no surprise that these racist stereotypes have influenced the medicine that we use to treat people today. One example is the BMI, in which the original cutoffs for each weight categories were calculated by data from only Caucasian people. But we're in 2021, medicine has come such a long way and we're living longer than ever, but we're still seeing these healthcare disparities between ethnic groups. I've shown you the figures from COVID-19, but we can see medical racism in much more simple examples. Take the pulse oximeter, a device used to measure the amount of oxygen in one's blood. A 2020 study has found that it can actually underestimate hypoxemia, so a lack of oxygen in the blood, for people with darker skin. Now, this leaves us with one of our staple baseline observations in medicine, less accurate for BAME people compared with that of their white counterparts, which could lead to the underdetection of a condition that will inevitably kill someone. Furthermore, other medical measurements such as kidney function testing, lung function testing, fracture risk assessment, and even organ donor viability screening all use race as a factor in calculating the result. Now, apart from this being kind of unscientific, as race is a social construct and not a biological marker that can be measured, these results can also become a barrier to treatment for minority ethnic patients. A better approach to offer holistic care would be to take into account the lived experience one has because of their race, not just the color of their skin. So, we're back to my original question. How are these things linked? COVID-19 gives us a clear example of the fact that the systems that we live in were not built for all, but for the benefit of those in power. This now negatively affects other minority groups in society, such as LGBTQ+ people, disabled people, marginalized genders, neurodivergent people, and of course, fat people. But the difference with fat phobia is that it is still socially acceptable to outwardly bully people for a trait that's mostly genetic. We instill this into our children to the point that they would rather have a disability than be fat, and we encourage the ridicule of fat people through pervasive stereotypes in the media. A way we can overcome this culture of judgment and discrimination is through a combination of systemic change, education, and kindness. The systemic change we need to see is greater than changing our medical devices after the fact, or seeing racism as a constellation of individual events. Racism has its effects from the time of birth and is so deeply ingrained in society that it's really hard to tell where it starts and ends. This means that we require a serious reevaluation of our policies, practices, and cultures if we're truly to stamp out racism and have any chance at true change. A key way in which we can achieve this is education, as knowledge is power. We've already started empowering people with anti-racism workshops, seminars, and tutorials. But there's a lot of work to be done still for fat bias. We need our children from young to be taught healthful behaviors in the aim of self-care, not fat avoidance. And we need our healthcare providers to adopt a health at every size approach, with weight bias being included in their equality and diversity training. We've got work to do. Doing the work can be from home, at your local coffee shop, or even introspectively. But what matters here is that we uproot our subconscious beliefs, and we do this in the name of truth, science, and fairness. Lastly, I'd like to encourage you all to have compassion for each other, but also for yourselves. My own journey of self-love stems from a place of very low self-esteem and just wishing my body away most of my life. I dieted and shrunk myself and just wished I could wave a magic wand and change my mix of features. All along, I thought that this girl was the problem. That I was stupid, lazy, unattractive, and only lucky to be in any positive position I was in. Not deserving. To finish, I'd like to tell all of you what I would tell her now. You are bold, you are brilliant, and you are smart. Your body is an amazing vessel for you to sail through this world in, so treat it with love. Use kindness and wisdom, not the opinions of others, to decide how to keep it. Don't starve it, hate it, and harm it, for it's just trying its best to protect you. Lastly, but not least, feed it well, lots of dumplings. Move it joyfully, even your squeaky Dr. Martens boots, and let it rest and relax, as there will be storms on your journey. But like everything, it will pass. Thank you very much, everyone.